Well, welcome back. Now, elections, climate change, and of course, geopolitical divisions, among others, including the conflicts, these are set to dominate the year ahead. Now, while South Africans go to the polls later this year, a key election to watch will also be that, of course, of a rematch between US President Joe Biden and his twice-impeached predecessor, Donald Trump, who faces a deluge of legal trouble in the run-up to that November poll. Now, at the United Nations in New York, there's also growing anxiety about how the body can better respond to conflicts and also growing humanitarian burden that results from the conflicts that exist around the world at the moment, like the catastrophes that are unfolding in Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, and many other hotspots around the world, which we very often don't even touch on. And this, as we take a look at what to expect in 2024. And joining me here in studio, it's so nice to have you in studio, Sherwin. I don't know if you realize how excited we all get when you're here, because we come here every morning and there's a report from Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York.
Sakina, not as excited as I am to see you in the flesh.
But we do this every year, but we still get so excited every year to do it.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome home. And how has it been on the home front, coming back to South Africa and just taking a look at everything that's happening?
I'm from the Eastern Cape. I went straight to East London to be with my family, Emonti, and it rained every day. I had a bit of a cold. The weather wasn't warm. I couldn't go to the beach. I was a little frustrated, but thank goodness for Johannesburg, where we got a little sunshine.
And you brought the rain with you, I see.
Could have been snow. You're lucky.
We'll take the rain. We'll take the rain. Sherwin, so much to talk about, if we look at what's happening in the world. Starting off with right now, what's happening in Gaza, which seems to be top of mind for most people. And given that South Africa has taken that very bold stance of taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. So, this, of course, is a big one that's going to unfold later this week.
But let's put the big one in context, right? What should your expectations be? What are the realities that might evolve from the hearing of this case in The Hague by the 15 judges of the International Court of Justice? Essentially, they have to answer a question. Has Israel violated the 1948 Convention on Genocide? This is the case that South Africa will present. They are making the case that Israel has violated the Genocide Convention. Israel, of course, has accused South Africa of blood libel. Essentially a anti-Semitic canard that talks about how Jews wanted to sell the blood of Christians in the Middle Ages. So, of course, that is a dispute that will now be settled by the International Court of Justice. Is Israel in violation of that convention or not? And, there's a lot of talk about whether these rulings are binding, legally binding, and what is called a contentious case, Sakina, essentially where two states parties, an interstate party dispute, which is essentially what is going on. The court is now going to rule as to whether that convention is in violation. There are other judgments that are rendered by the International Court of Justice called advisory opinions. We saw an advisory opinion in 2004 when the court ruled that Israel's barrier wall was illegal under international law. We saw another advisory opinion, which is not binding, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine in March of 2022, where essentially the court found that Russia was violating international law and needed to stop its military actions in Ukraine. Of course, none of that has happened. In this instance, the judgment will be binding, but the question that remains is, will it change the calculus on the ground? Will Israel comply with a binding decision from essentially the judicial body of the United Nations? And if history is our guide, we can surmise that they probably will not. Israel is in violation of several Security Council resolutions, most notably the 2016 resolution that was passed at the end of the Obama administration in 2016, which basically passed a resolution that said Israeli settlements are illegal under international law. Has Israel since then stopped their the expansion of Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territories? They have not. So history being our guide, don't expect too much, even if this falls in a certain way. Implementation is often where member states fail at the United Nations, no less the state of Israel.
And this, of course, has caused some to, call on the United Nations to actually be more firm, forceful in trying to enforce, some of these recommendations as they were. But also, Sherwin, this is becoming an indictment on the United Nations and what it stands for. And many are saying, well, if you look at the Security Council
right.
and the powers to veto in that Security Council, the fact that it is not universally representative, these are all issues that the United Nations has to grapple with.
It's important, I think, to understand the UN Secretariat that implements the decisions of member states and the member states of the United Nations. Sometimes we talk about the UN as it's some big monolithic thing, but there are different parts to the UN. And I think the Secretariat would argue that they are doing the very best they can. They've been very front and center in trying to denounce what is happening in Gaza, trying to stop the war, calling for a permanent ceasefire. But they cannot implement that decision without a decision from the Security Council. We've seen the non-binding decision by the General Assembly, I think 150 plus states voting in favor of Israel, a permanent ceasefire with immediate effect in Israel, in Gaza, but has that been implemented? No, because it's non-binding, it's legally non-binding. So then you look to the Security Council and this 1948 makeup that essentially gives 5 permanent members veto power over broad consensus sometimes in that Security Council. And so let me read you something that the UN Charter tells us in terms of judgments by the International Court of Justice. If any party to a case fails to perform the obligations incumbent upon it under the judgment rendered by the court, the other party, in this case, say, for example, South Africa, may have recourse to the Security Council, which may, if it deems necessary, make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken to give effect to that judgment. Now, you ask me, how on earth is that going to happen with the United States? Having deployed its veto on this conflict so many times already, how on earth, having called this case without merit, is that going to be the final arbiter? The Security Council is now going to say, well, Israel, the court has ruled against you, or South Africa, the court has ruled against you, now we have to implement it. The court has no standing military that's going to impose a judgment on someone. The United Nations doesn't have a standing military that's going to force them to comply. It's up to the members of the Security Council through various tools. Sanctions, for example, the threat of military action. That's not going to happen when the US has a veto.
So that's a question, I suppose, that you and I, cannot necessarily
So we'll get clarity
solve
on whether it's genocide or not. But then what?
Then what? And that's exactly it. And we could talk about this forever and a day, but there are other issues, Sherwin, like, for example, the elections in the US later this year.
Right.
And, of course, this particular matter, the war in Ukraine, and, of course, some domestic political issues, one would imagine, will weigh heavily on how that election pans out.
Yeah, and in a year that we have the Paris Olympics, no one's really talking about that, right? And so we have this big election, not only in South Africa, but in the United States, a possible rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It hasn't been settled yet because Donald Trump hasn't won the Republican nomination, but he is the outright front runner. I mean, there's a campaign going on right now. There are other names, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, Ron DeSantis, former governor of New Jersey called Chris Christie, but never shall they see the light of day in terms of winning that nomination. Donald Trump is beating them heavily without having appeared in a single debate. So it is essentially going to be, if the planets align for Donald Trump, which it appears to be doing, a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. 70-plus, 78-year-old versus an 80-something-year-old. Not very popular among the youth in that regard, but it's going to be a very tough political year, convincing people to vote this way or that. The insurrection, of course, they just marked the 3rd anniversary of the attempted undermining of the certification of the results when Joe Biden won 3 years ago. That is going to play front and center. Issues of democracy being undermined, the future of America being a question in this election. But as someone said many years ago, I think when Bill Clinton was running against George H.W. Bush, the senior Bush, it's about the economy, stupid. And in the third quarter of last year, the economy in the United States grew by 4.9%. A $25 trillion economy grew by such a margin. It's going to come down to the economy, how people feel about it, how inflation is petering out, and then the emotional part. Donald Trump supporters aren't going to vote for anybody else. Joe Biden supporters are not going to vote for anybody else. It's going to come down to those independents in the middle.
But you said something earlier about, yes, the economy may have grown, but what does that mean for ordinary Americans?
How do you feel, right? You talk, but the numbers also matter, right? Employment in the US is around 3.4%. The economy is growing. Joe Biden has created so many jobs post the pandemic. But do people feel that? How is inflation, to what extent has it petered out in terms of food prices, the ability to travel? It's very much an emotional feeling. And within the next few months, Joe Biden will be seeking to solidify those numbers. The feeling needs to translate. But Donald Trump will certainly be trying to undercut that narrative.
So, Sherwin, with the conflict in the Middle East, the war in the Middle East, we seem to have pushed to the background what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. So how much of an issue is that still in the United States?
It is a massive issue. It is a big issue, particularly in the United States Congress, because the United States has been one of the biggest funders of Ukraine's military defense of the Russian invasion. And currently, right now, you have a big divide within the Republican Party in the United States Congress that's trying to leverage more funding for Ukraine, which is a big ask from the White House currently, with more money towards immigration and dealing with the southern border. There is a lot of people trying to enter the United States from the Mexico side. And that is a big political issue for the Republicans in the United States. And so they're trying to leverage, yes, we'll give you some more money, maybe for Ukraine, if you deal with this. So that's a debate that's currently playing itself out. While the Ukrainians are buckling right now, they need that money quickly. It's not clear as and when that's going to happen.
Which is quite interesting because the United States government must be spending quite a lot of money on, wars that they are not necessarily directly involved in.
Have you heard a term called the military-industrial complex?
Yes. So that's how they are involved.
So they're spending money to support Ukraine, but a lot of that money is going on weapons being manufactured in the United States. So it's a full circle. There is an economic benefit for this war to continue, although they won't say that explicitly, right? They are talking about Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty that has been undermined. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been found by the ICJ, the very court that is going to be front and center this week, to be illegal. Why aren't the South Africans waving that judgment around, right? To force Russia to withdraw if that judgment, if that court matters so much. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves, Sakina.
And then, of course, climate change. We are seeing in South Africa, I was just speaking to Pemelo Zonke, our meteorologist, earlier about the sort of climate patterns that we are seeing. The flooding, for example, we had flash floods here in Joburg on Friday, terrible. And then I saw that because it was trending, but then I also saw in other parts of the world, in the UK, in Japan, at the same time, they were also experiencing floods. So that must be a big issue as well in the United States.
Climate change is an existential threat, whether you are most responsible for it or not, whether you are making the case to continue using fossil fuels or not. There's a big debate currently between the future of coal and fossil fuels and digging for oil, between the developing South and the developed North. You've achieved your economic benchmarks, your growth. It's time for us, with South Africa has huge coal deposits. They want to exploit this to the hilt. The Secretary General is saying we need to move away from fossil fuels very, very quickly. I think the deadline is by 2040. Certain countries have to be completely fossil fuel emission neutral. South Africa is making the case that we need to exploit this further based on the economic and development deficits that face a country that is essentially a developing economy. But climate change doesn't then say, well, you're most responsible, we're going to go and, hurricane in Florida only. No, you're seeing the extreme climate in many parts of South Africa, severe rainfall. And what does it beg the question about? How are we building infrastructure to make it more resilient for what we know is coming? That's a big ask. That takes a lot of money. That means that the developed North has a big responsibility to capacitate what's called the Green Climate Fund, to capacitate what's now called the Loss and Damage Fund. But the money doesn't flow so quickly. We have been talking about this for a long time. I think for the first time last year, the 100 billion that they were asking for about 10 years ago was finally met. So, yeah,
it doesn't flow so quickly, and it's always conditional.
And climate change is here.
Which is part of the problem.
These debates are just time waste. Climate change is here. It's coming. We need to be fortifying ourselves for what is coming. Sinking oceans. Rising oceans, sinking land mass. The ice caps in the Arctic are melting. The Secretary General was in Antarctica standing with penguins to highlight this issue late last year. So we need to get on the same page very, very quickly because climate change is very egalitarian in how devastating it's going to be.
So speaking of, things that happen and sometimes we need to get on the same page, but perhaps we won't. South Africa and the United States, there was that infamous Lady R incident, the whole Russia-Ukraine war, now Gaza and what's happening with Israel, and of course South Africa and the United States on diametrically opposing sides.
Well, the United States, of course, coming out very quickly to say that this case has no merit. Listen, friends can disagree, I think is what the International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, likes to say. So this is another example of friends disagreeing. But at the core of this, you are seeing a geopolitical shift more globally. And South Africa, certainly since taking over as chair of BRICS, has been very much at the center of the shift, right? We've got the new members of BRICS. It's becoming a force unto itself. It could be a counterpoint moving forward towards in terms of the G7, which is the big, powerful economic bloc in the world. So the sands are shifting under our feet, but there is no scenario where I see the one opposing the other. We all need each other. The global economy is so interlinked. Yes, you can disagree on things, but there are fundamental things that are important, like AGOA, trade. Things that matter to people's pockets and the economy, and that, at the end of the day, like it is in the US election, matters in daily lives. What is the big picture here? Do you want to fight with the United States, or do you want to disagree with them and still do things on the side?
Well, those are some of the questions that we will continue to grapple with. What an absolute pleasure having you. Sherwin Bryce-Pease. And Sherwin, of course, home on a break. And he is the SABC News' US correspondent, talking to us about some of the international stories to look out for in 2024. And hopefully you'll come back and do a mid-year thing.
I'll probably be back later this week on the ICJ case on Thursday. But another thing before we go, my mother insists the meteorologist, the weather guy, on the show must please give her the weather update on M1T every day. East London, please, every day. There you go, Mom.
Tell your mom. We'll pass on the message like we pass on all the messages, but of course, East London must be on the map. That's where we have to leave it. Can you believe it? Time's up. Time flies when you're having fun. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, of course, he's going to be around for a while longer, but that's it from Morning Live for today. We'll catch you again bright and early tomorrow morning at 6. Take care.